Today we're going to talk about binding. Binding can either make or break your project. So we want to show you how to make sure it makes your project instead of breaks it. Today we're going to talk about the different types of binding, where you would use it, and how it affects the technique of your project.
I'm going to start off first just showing you a couple different types of binding. The first one is your traditional binding, generally done either 2.5 inches or 2 1/4. And so you basically cut it into strips. So your strips together on an angle, fold it in half and iron it. And so when you put it on your quilt piece, you actually start by sewing down this side first and then fold it to the other side to complete it. So you have the clean edge here. That will be what we see at the end of the project. The other type of binding is double fold binding. It's very similar to making bias, if you've ever made bias tape, but the difference is you're not cutting on a bias because it's not going to be stretchy like that. But you can use a bias maker to make this kind. Again, you're going to determine the size that you want. In this case, I'm guessing this is probably about 2.5. And so you start very similar to this one. You start by folding it in half and pressing it. But then you open it up and you're going to match your raw edge to your inside line that's created by the pressing, and press that down and press on the other side. I use this kind of binding a lot when I'm making bags or something where it's a really thick quilt, because you have the perfect edge here and I don't have to tack it down first. If I can just pretend like this wasn't done, all I have to do is put it on there and sew once all the way around and complete that. And so when you have those really tough corners or a 3-dimensional project, this type of binding is going to be really helpful for that.
Angelique, can I show one more way to use that type of binding?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So this binding is actually my favorite type to use. I find that my measurements are never exact. The edges get wonky when I use this type of binding. But if I'm going to bind a quilt and do the edge, I will use this type of binding, open it up and sew it on the same way I would like this, with that raw edge towards, and then it folds over and you get a perfect edge every time because it's already measured out. You know that this needs to go on the edge of your quilt. It works every time and I love it.
That reminds me, I did use that kind of binding once when we were making shoes, and I totally forgot about that way of doing it. So thanks for reminding me. It's been a while since I made those shoes. It was like last Halloween, so you'll see those coming this Halloween, because yeah. Anyway, I'm going to show you some just basic already bound things to look at. Our first is hand binding. So with hand binding, you're going to start, again, whichever one you want to use, you're going to start by lining that up and sewing that 1/4 inch and then the fold over part. But instead, you're then going to sit in front of your TV. I know a lot of people who like to do that, put on their crime shows or whatever they like to binge. And they're just going to sit there and they're just going to slowly hand sew so that you get a very invisible stitch. You just catch a few pieces of the material and it just makes a really clean binding. And I can show you in comparison, and then I'll talk about this binding in a minute. But when you machine bind, you're going to have those ridges of stitches that you can see here. So that eliminates that when you want something that's just really clean and pristine. So speaking of machine binding, this here is a great example of stitch in the ditch. So stitch in the ditch is once you've done that first part, right, you put that binding on and you sew down, you fold it over. I am a big clip that binding to hold it nice and flat. And then I'll slide the binding because it just helps me keep it flat down while I'm doing that sewing. But then you make sure that you're right here in this ridge with your needle. So slow and steady, or if you have a stitch in the ditch foot that has the little flange, like a knife, that's gonna help. And you just follow this along. And so you don't see so much of the stitching on this side. It blends in really nicely with the quilting, but you will see it on the back side. Another one I want to show you right quick is when you're doing kind of the round one here. So very similarly, what she had shown, we did some stitch in the ditch here, but this is a good example where you might use a bias type of binding where you have a little bit of stretch to it, so that when you go around the curves, it just makes it a little bit easier to do that. But again, we're stitching in the ditch, we're just doing it in a curved way. One of the things that helps when you're doing curved edges with binding is you can do a few little cuts with your scissors when you're going around particularly sharp curves, and that's going to help spread it out on the inside, but you're not going to see it on the outside. So those are some examples of some simple ways to do binding to finish your projects. Sabrina, what do you have for us?
Perfect. Well, actually, speaking of trimming your edges, you have to do that when you do a funky edge. This here has what I would call a rickrack border. So it goes in and out. And so when you tack on this binding, it's the same as you would do with any other quilt. It's very simple. You use your binding strip, you fold it over, and then once you're tacking it on, all you do is line up your edges just the same as you would on a 90-degree mitered corner. You end up with these perfect points on every edge. And this one is actually hand bound. So when you get into this middle piece here, you just trim the edge and pull it out flat. So this lays flat when you go to use it on your machine. It's perfect. We also have here, this is probably my favorite binding that I've done in a very long time. And I learned this technique about a year ago, and it's just hand stitching. But it gives it that old-fashioned, kind of grandma-y, homey look to it. I love it. Just gives it a little bit more depth and more love. So this is actually done with embroidery floss. You use a wider needle, and it ends up giving you this look, but it's completely stable. You don't have to worry about machine washing it or hand washing it. It's very simple, and it's secure.
Kind of looks like a running stitch.
It does, but it's not. That's the secret to it. It's lots of fun. The fun part is you just go underneath the whole time. So it's extra secure. When you have your binding lifted up, you could be able to see it, but I am not about to tear this apart because it's a work of art. Our last binding that we have to show here is what I call a flange binding. I know that's not correct, but this is flannel back satin. And it helps if you have projects that you do quilt as you go. I don't know if you guys have seen Carla's puff quilt. It's beautiful, but you don't quilt on the backing. And so if you have a piece, which like this one, this was actually done for my cousin's daughter, but you can embroider on it. It makes it very simple. And then you can do your quilt sandwich. You put your binding on the inside with right sides together, and you sew all the way around, making pleats. You can do your mitered corner, so it's lots of fun for those kids to snuggle up with. It makes it so fun. And then you just turn it out and stitch it right together. This one actually is not all the way stitched together. So it just needs to be finished off with a simple hand stitching on the edge, and you'll be good to go.
That's awesome. It's a beautiful blanket, by the way.
Thank you.
Well, I hope we have inspired you to try some different binding techniques to frame your next project.
Awesome. In the comments, just tell us what you want to see more of. We'd love to demonstrate some of these techniques on future episodes. But thank you for joining us on Tuesdays with Grace. Next week, we'll be talking about design boards, how to use them in different size spaces, small design boards, large design boards, anything to fit your space. And we're so excited. Can't wait to see you next week.